Hey, hi guys. So as promised, I am making some videos for you guys to do some review of certain elements that we're working on in class, certain types of responses, things that you should know for your exam, different types of texts that we are writing throughout the semester. So this video here is talking about poetry responses specifically. So I've already made videos on the figures of speech, which you should have already been diving into, reviewing. Before you can really write a poetry response, you have to know the figures of speech. So I'm hoping this is your step 2 in that journey. As a reminder, these videos do not have the goal of covering everything that we would do in class. The idea behind these videos is that they are review. So I'm just giving you some of the tips of things that I've noticed over the years in my 10 years of teaching and marking provincial exams. Things that I would want you guys to know and to practice in class when it comes to analyzing a poem, writing about poetry, how to organize it, how to approach a poem. I'm just going to give you some of those tips here. And that way, ultimately, you know what to expect when you go in. Because obviously, when you get to your exam, I can't tell you what you're going to get. I don't know what types of poems you're going to get. I can't guarantee you what types of questions, prompts you're going to get. There's absolutely no guarantees for that. But what I can do is give you at least some tips to be prepared for different types of scenarios, and that whether you have a short or long poem, a more modern or older poem, that you know how to approach them. So that's kind of the goal behind this here. So as a reminder, when you get to your exam, you get 2 booklets. Okay, you get 2 of these. One's called the process booklet, one is called the responding to text booklet. So in the process booklet, you're going to have typically the 2 poems. That's what we'll be talking about today. And then you have your place where you have to write your response. Okay, as a reminder, everything that I'm telling you here is pertaining to this exam. Obviously, it's relevant to poetry in general. Like when you practice poems in class, if you guys go on to study poetry or literature past this class, obviously this can be relevant for that too. But I'm talking specifically about the exam. You have to remember that when you have these booklets, when I talk about taking notes, when I talk about making a plan, you can do so all over these pages. These pages are yours. Well, not mine in class, don't do that to mine. But when you get to your exam, you can write whatever you want all over this booklet. So when I say make sure you're annotating, make sure that you're taking note of the main idea, make sure that you're finding the figures of speech, I want you to actually write them on these pages. So don't be afraid just because it's an official document that you can't write on them. You absolutely can. Okay, so in class, you'll get photocopies. On the exam, you get the real deal. Make sure that you know that you can write all over these. And actually, we as teachers, as markers, once we get to the January or June marking session, when we look at it, we can see where your thought process was. We can see whether you really worked through it and broke down the poem. So in fact, it actually can be helpful to you to actually write down everything you see, everything you notice about the poem on these booklets. Okay, so let's get started. So first thing that you need to know about poetry responses. So the goal of the poetry response is to demonstrate your ability to understand figurative language, to read between the lines, and to understand both implicit and explicit messages. So a few things that come together here. Again, you need to understand figurative language. So we've talked about figures of speech already. You should know what a metaphor is, what is a euphemism, what is a hyperbole, what do they look like, and what do they do in poetry. So it's not just being able to blah, blah definition of what is a metaphor, but do you know what effect they have on the message of a poem? Like, why would an author use a metaphor? You should be able to do that. And in a poetry response, we're looking for you to demonstrate that ability. Okay? To read between the lines means that you are able to read a message or read a poem and find a message that isn't explicit. It's not obvious and in your face. You're able to kind of figure things out that aren't told to you straight like that. Okay, so again, oftentimes figurative language does that, right? It hints at things, it doesn't say it directly. We want to be able to see that even though the message wasn't told to you right in your face, without any question, without any shadow of a doubt, that you're able to figure it out. We want to see that mental process. And then, of course, being able to find the difference between explicit and implicit. So sometimes authors will say something that is literal, right? They mean it. It's explicit. I'm having a bad day means I'm having a bad day, right? That's just standard. Implicit is, again, messages that are hinted at that you're reading between the lines. And you have to be able to do a bit of both when you're reading a poem. So that's kind of the goal behind them. One of the other things that you have to be able to do with poetry responses is you must be able to understand the poem. That's pretty basic, I know, but oftentimes students are discouraged when they get a low mark on a poetry response, a 2, a 3, whatever. And what they're frustrated with is they thought that they got it. But again, though it is subjective and though there can be different approaches to a poem, different understandings of it, there are still sometimes right and wrong answers. Like you can still be on another planet when you're reading a poem. So we are looking to see that you know how to understand something that is not obvious, that you are able to figure it out. So naturally, you got to make sure that when you read this, you get it. It takes practice, and not everyone does that come for naturally. You have to be able to identify the techniques, okay? For 90% of the tasks that you'll get that are poetry related on the exam, they're going to ask you to find figures of speech. Okay, that's why we focus so much on it in class. That's why we do quizzes. That's why we do practice. That's why I obviously did a whole video or 2 videos on it, is because you need to know figures of speech to be able to understand a poem. And then on this exam, they want you to find them. So you cannot simply understand the poem. That's a great start. You have to also be able to say, well, how did I get to that understanding, which is the figures of speech. Okay, so you got to find them, and you have to determine what they did for the poem and for its overall message. And you have to explain how or why they are used. Those are 2 different things. So the how a technique is used refers to what it does to the overall message. The why is its intention behind it. So the author employs figures of speech maybe because they want to make it more beautiful, more flowery language. They want you to imagine, right? So rather than just saying something directly, by making it a little bit more flowery in its language, you're starting to picture what they're describing. You feel like you're there because there's sensory details in the writing. They do that for a reason, right? Poetry is not just you write it to get it done. Poetry is for the enjoyment of it, for the self-expression. So always ask yourself, like, why are they writing it the way they are? And you have to try and find that intention. What are they trying to do with this poem? What are they trying to say, and why are they trying to say it? So that's going to be where the real analysis comes in the poetry, is that you're going to have to try and really think through what the poem is for and why it's being written. Okay? Which in other words means, what's their effect on you? Okay? We'll look at that with some examples shortly. So that's what you need to basically know. A couple other things, okay? These are just tips, things that I've noticed. Not promises, they're just kind of some tips. So first and foremost, you are typically given 2 poems on the exam. As you can see in this example here, there are 2 poems that you can choose from. I would say 95% of the time, you're going to have 2 poems that are provided, and you get to pick between them. The reason for that is pretty obvious. Naturally, not everybody likes poetry. And even on top of that, even people who like poetry, not everything resonates. Sometimes you read something and you're like, that means nothing to me. And I feel that a lot of the time too. So by offering you 2 poems that are going to be quite different in nature, usually they're giving you something that one of them you can work with, right? Like that one maybe didn't mean anything to me, but the other one, I get it more. Or this one had figures of speech that I'm not necessarily familiar with, but this one I get a little bit better, whatever. So they typically will give you 2 choices. Is that always the case? No. As you can see, my next point, rarely, but sometimes you only get one, okay? So one of the examples you're gonna work on in class is called The Weather. It's from a very old exam of 2014, I believe. And in that particular year, they only provided 1 poem. In that case, it wasn't a problem. Okay, you guys will see very quickly when we practice it in class, it's a poem that is full of technique use. It is full of messages that you guys can understand because they're so present in your life. So it's not a problem. Like we're putting you at a disadvantage by giving you only 1 there. Sometimes though, only 1 poem kind of sucks. Another example of when they only did that, they only gave you 1, was last year, 2025, or no, pardon me, January 2026. And they only gave 1 poem. The reason for that was a bit of a mix-up in the printing, so it wasn't intentional, but the province was only able to provide 1 poem, and the poem was called Wayne. And it was a person talking about their brother, their father, kind of their family life. And it was a poem that really, caused some problems for a lot of issues because it was very implicit in its message provided. You had to really figure it out. Now, what they did to make up for that is they gave a prompt that was a little bit easier, in my opinion, because they only gave you one poem and a tougher poem at that. So I think they kind of tried to balance it out. But typically, they're only going to give you one. On rare occasions, they're typically going to give you two. Okay? Sometimes you're going to be asked to provide a comparison between the two poems provided. This one I don't see very often, but sometimes they'll ask you to look at the two poems and to talk about how the messages are different or are similar, how one communicates something better than another one. So in that case, you really do have to read both and analyze both before you write the response. Now, of course, I always recommend you read both poems. Don't just read the first thing and go. What if the second one's really good? So you should always read both, but some of these prompts will ask you to compare the two. Again, that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes you're asked which poem you preferred or even connected to personally. So when I said that poem from January 2026 was only one poem, but they gave an easier prompt, you'll see it in one of the slides to come. It was a preference one, or like a connection. How do you feel? What did you think? What do you imagine? So what's nice about that is your personal opinions cannot be argued with as long as you're backing them up. So that does make it a little bit easier, okay? But the preference one is definitely the easiest prompt, okay? Whether you read both, you say which one you liked and why you liked it. That's the easiest prompt you could ever get. I've only seen it a couple times since I've started teaching this exam, but it has happened, I'd say 2-3 times. And so it's good to be prepared for that. You still need to know figures of speech. You still need to know how to annotate a poem to have valid reasons why you liked it or not. But that's definitely the easiest prompt you'll get. Again, I don't want to put it in your heads that that's the one you're going to get because it doesn't come back super commonly, but you might be asked, which poems do you like? Okay. But most often, okay, you are going to be asked to find the message of the poem and to explain which techniques communicated that message. So this last bullet point here, this is really the task that we're going to try to work on the most in class, the one that I want you to be most prepared for, because that's typically the hardest thing to do. And so naturally, we want to see that you can attain that. Okay, so can you figure out after reading the poem what the author was trying to say? What is the main message? We're going to talk about that shortly. And not just say, well, it is that. I know it's about this. Okay, I instinctively got it. Now it's breaking it down. I like to always use the metaphor of maths when we say showing your work. You might know the answer, right? You might know exactly how you got to the end of some certain complicated equation, but just because you know it and you're some super genius doesn't mean that you know how to break down all the steps. We want to see that you can break down the steps. So you might have automatically gotten to the ending and said, the poem's about this. But now I want to see which line got you to that message. And why that line? Is it because there's a figure of speech? Probably. So then what is the figure of speech? What's the effect of that figure of speech? So you're really breaking down step by step how your brain makes these automatic connections really quickly, but you're doing it now in a very laid out, simplified way. You're showing us how your brain gets to that main message and what the author did to get you there. Okay, so that's probably the one you're going to be working on the most in class and the one you're likely to get on the exam as your question. Okay, so how do you approach a poem? So poetry, like anything, any text, there's a lot of things that are going to be the same. You're going to follow some of the same steps to be able to understand the text, to make sure that you're not missing context and details. A lot of those are going to be shared, but I still want to talk about the poem on its own. So first and foremost, you're always going to want to consider information that is provided on the page. So in this case, specific to the exam, naturally, it's not like you get a ton of information provided, but as you can see, you have a title, okay, you have an author, there's a little bit of context offered on either the author themselves, on when they wrote it, where they wrote it, maybe a little bit of what they did in their lives, where they're from, whatever. And again, that information is given for a reason, okay? Any type of context is useful. If you to look back on some of your favorite authors, some of your favorite filmmakers, actors, whatever, they all do the things they do for a reason, right? We are motivated by our life experiences, by our environments. And so if it tells you an author is from a certain place or they had experience in certain type of work, that probably is meant to inform your understanding of the text as a whole. So don't ignore that information, right? Don't let it be the father of the thought where if it says that they're from a certain place, it has to be about that, but definitely consider it. So that context is absolutely important, okay? But naturally, I want you to also remember that when you're not doing this for an exam, go and do some research, okay? One of my favorite examples that I teach with grade 12s is Oscar Wilde. So Oscar Wilde, very famous playwright, wrote The Importance of Being Earnest, which is this super strong critique of Victorian society and kind of how prissy they were and how some of their mentalities were really backwards and stupid, and they cared about things that were not important. And you would just think it's like, oh, it's a funny play. He's making fun of these silly people. When you look back on his life and the way that he was ostracized, the way that he was taken in by society and then cast out when they saw that he was different than them, now you start to see, oh, I can see why he would critique society, because he saw that they were very surface level in their treatment of each other, that they were vapid, that they had terrible values, whatever. And so by understanding his story, his writing, and the goals behind his writing make way more sense. Okay, so research them when you can. Naturally, when you're doing it on exam, you're limited, you can't go and do research, but they are giving you some information, and that information is there for a reason. So make sure you look at it, okay? So above the title, the author, and the context, some other things you can look at is the style, the theme of the exam, right? This poem is linked to the theme for a reason, so look into that. Or even the topic of the poem, right? What are they actually writing about? How does that relate to the exam, right? How does it relate to the poem as a whole? Are they literally talking about that thing, or is it more dancing around the subject in a figurative sense? So try and consider all of that information before you even read the poem. Then you're going to read the poem once, okay? I don't want you spending all this time taking notes, jotting things down on the page the first time you read the poem. Again, they're not going to give you really long ones. So the first time you read the poem, I want you to always just give it one quick read to understand it. Just get a general sense, let it have an impact on you or not if it's not resonating, but give it one read through and then see where you're at, okay? Once you've done that, and if you've done it with both, then give it a second read. And in that second read, your goal is usually to identify the techniques, okay? Like I said, 90% of the time, they're going to be asking you to find the figures of speech that communicated the message. So you need to do that. But even if you're being asked which poem you preferred, you still need to understand why you preferred it. So you want to break it down, annotate, find out which lines really stuck with you or like you found entertaining, where the metaphor was that you really liked, whatever. But you're going to do that on a second read, okay? Then I want you to create a short list of which techniques communicated, I called the mini message. And so every line has a message of its own, or every two lines. So try and find, like, this stanza is saying this, these two lines is saying that. And so try and break it down to whether there's topic changes throughout the poem, right? Or is it just one same thing that's kind of being repeated and communicated in several different ways? Break that down in the margins of the poem. So don't just say, this is a metaphor. Okay, well, what is the metaphor saying? It means what, right? So these two lines are telling me this. Because all those little mini messages through the next 2, 3, 4 lines, they get you to the sum of the entire message of the poem that you understand at the end, okay? And then once you've done that, you want to figure out which of these little mini messages communicated that main message for you so that you are able to make a plan for your response. So if you have a poem that had 15 figures of speech, which you could very feasibly have, you're not going to talk about all 15, right? So which ones were essential to really getting you to that final understanding of the poem? You're going to make like a little plan, kind of in the margins. It could be on a brouillon, like on a separate page. It's completely up to you. But I want you to, at the end, go, okay, what is it about? And which mini messages, which mini technique choices are the ones that got me there, okay? You never want to start your response just like blind running in or only knowing which is going to be your first technique you're going to talk about that. I want you to have a plan before you start, because I often find through rushing, through being stressed, because there's a time element, as you guys know, then I typically find that we get halfway through and go, I only had 2 things to talk about, or I'm repeating myself. So by already foreseeing which techniques you're going to talk about, which messages you want to talk about, you're going to avoid a little bit of that confusion. Okay? Okay, some examples of prompts that you might encounter. Naturally, I can't make any promises. I never know what they're going to ask you. Even if I did know and they told me, I would not be at liberty to tell you. But I can give you some tips on the things that I've seen. In 10 years, I've done a lot of exams, and so I've seen some patterns. I've seen the ones that come back so frequently. I can just give you a little bit some hints and some tips, okay? So again, the first one is the easiest one. Explain which poem you prefer. Support your response with reference to the poem or poems, depending on if you're going to talk about both. So what you'll see in a separate video is I'm going to talk about trombone solo and I Think Continually. This is one such response where they did that. They had you 2 poems to read. They asked you which one you liked. You just had to justify why you liked it. Like super easy peasy. But again, the gold in the writing is in you justifying it, not just saying I liked it, but why you liked it. So I've seen that prompt come back a couple times. It's definitely happened. Be prepared for it. Know how to justify why you like something. Don't just say, because I liked it. And equally, don't just say, because I don't like poetry. Those are lame and very empty answers. So make sure you know how to justify yourself and to why you liked something for actual reasons, other than just, I do or I don't. But that's definitely a prompt that could come up. It's just not the most frequently used one. Okay? You'll see that number 2 and number 3 are very similar. Okay, but I still wanted to differentiate how they are different, just so that you guys know and don't feel blindsided when you see the differences on an exam. So number 2, you might get a prompt that reads, analyze how the poet uses language and or techniques to communicate an idea about blank, blank, blank. Consider diction, imagery, metaphor, simile, symbolism, etc. So there's 2 things I want you to note about this prompt. So first and foremost, I put a blank because what they're usually putting in that blank is the theme of the exam. So let's imagine the exam that you got was cycles. That was 2024. So the prompt would read, analyze how the poet uses language and or techniques to communicate an idea about cycles. So you have to figure out what the poem is saying, but they're not just saying anything. If you come to the end of the poem and tell me that it's about unicorns are fake, whatever, that has nothing to do with cycles. I cannot find one obvious connection between unicorns being fake or whatever imagined to cycles. Where is the link? So they're already giving you a hint that the message that you're going to come to has something to do with something that is cyclical. Okay, things that come back again in life, things that happen to all of us generationally, whatever. Okay, things that just repeat themselves. So you already have a bit of a hint into what you're looking for. It has to be about that theme. As a side note, that doesn't mean you need to use the word in your main idea. So when you answer the prompt, you don't have to say, the poem, blah, 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 says something, something, something about cycles. You don't have to. That can be a little bit formulaic, but the theme should absolutely be obvious in the message that you chose. So for instance, let's say I read a poem and I said, trauma is generational. That is cyclical. That's about how we pass things down generation by generation, right? How things kind of do a 360, they always come back. That is definitely something to do with cycles, okay? If I were to say that human beings always repeat their mistakes, that's about cycles. So I don't need to say the word cycles just because it said it in the prompt, but my main idea has to be related to the theme. So in other words, you really can't go wrong if you understood the poem, because they're telling you the poem has something to do with this theme. So if you understood the poem, you'll get it. If you go in another direction and it has nothing to do with that theme, that's where you're going to encounter issues. So again, do not need to use the word of the theme. So in this case, I'm using cycles as an example. You don't have to say cycles in your main idea, but it has to be related to it. So it's just giving you a hint. The second thing I want to note about this prompt is that second sentence. So notice how they gave you some hints here to consider diction, imagery, metaphor, simile, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Now, that is telling you that these techniques are in the poem. Okay? If the prompt says that they're there, that means they have to be there. They're not going to lead you down a path in another direction and say, think about symbolism if there's no symbolism. They're telling you that it is in fact present. Now, the key to this, though, is if they gave you two poems, which most often they do, okay, does that mean that symbolism is present in both poems? Does that mean that there is a strong use of metaphor in both poems? Maybe not. But it's already telling you, hey, when you analyze these two, look for these things, because those might be the reasons that you got to this message about cycles in this example. So they are nice hints to have. But again, there is an etc., which means that when you know other figures of speech, you can use those. It doesn't have to be that you talk only about these. You can talk about other ones as well. Okay? So a couple hints in this prompt, but this is the most common prompt you're going to get, where it says, what's the poem about? Which techniques communicated it? So making that link between what is said and how it's said. That's most commonly what you're going to do. This one's just written with some of those little clues. The next one is a little bit more, it's the same thing, but it's a little bit more generalized, okay? So it reads, analyze how the language and or stylistic devices are used to communicate an idea, okay? Point. Consider, for example, diction, imagery, metaphor, symbolism, repetition, tone, etc. So really the second sentence, same thing that we saw here. Okay, there might be different techniques. It's doing the same thing. It's telling you these might be present. That first sentence is where the difference is. So notice that it says communicates an idea. Just an idea. They're not imposing on you that it has to be related to the theme. I use the example of cycles for this one. It doesn't have to be. They're just saying that there's an idea. Okay? So when you get to the end of the poem, you have to be able to discern what was it about? Right? I'm going to tell you, this poem is telling me courage is admirable, whatever, okay? That's the message of the poem. So if that's what you're saying the poem is about, that's your idea. Now you got to do just like you did for this one. Now you've got to tell me, how did you get to that message? You can't just say, because that's what it's about, because I just instinctively knew. You've got to be able to tell me which techniques got you to that message. So really, it's the same prompt. They're just not imposing on you that the theme has to be related, okay? These two, again, really the same thing. They're the ones that come the most often back up on the exam, okay? Number 4 is a little bit of a curveball, a different option, but just because it's written a little bit differently. So it reads, identify and explain a line or image from the poem that made an impression or an impact on you. Support your response with reference to the poem. So when I was talking about earlier that last year in, January 2025, 2026, that they gave only one poem because of a bit of a mix-up, but they gave a prompt that could be easier to work with. This is that prompt, okay? So if you really read it, it actually doesn't have to be a difficult task. Students that year were blindsided because we'd never seen anything written like this. That's why I'm showing you guys this now. But some people were blindsided by it and didn't know what to do. So let's really make sure we understand what this is asking for. So first you have to identify a line or an image. Okay, so that's the first thing you're looking for when you read that poem. Okay, there was one line that either had an impact, or made an impression. It meant something to you, like really it resonated. Or there was an image, there was something described that you pictured it in your mind as you were reading the poem. So notice that a line feels a little bit shorter. An image can talk about a larger part of the poem, perhaps in its entire stanza, right? It might be 4 lines together that in that whole stanza, you pictured what was happening, okay? So that can be pretty easy. They're not asking you to name, is it a metaphor, is it a hyperbole? They're just saying which line or which part. Where did you see something or read something that stuck with you, okay? Now, having an impression or an impact on you is all about your reaction, how you felt, how you understood it. So it's less about the analysis of the whole poem, which techniques communicated which things. It's about this line resonated, here's why it resonated with me. So it's more of a personal reaction. So this one's a little bit easier. Okay, you still have to support yourself by referencing the poem. You got to say which line or which lines if there's several. You still have to do all of that, but because it's more personal, it's harder to go wrong because you're just reacting on your own level. As long as you're able to explain yourself clearly and develop your points, there's no reason why you can't do really well with a prompt like that. So 4 and 1, easiest ones to do. 2 and 3, I'm sorry to tell you, probably what you're going to have to do, which is what's it about and which techniques communicated it. So this is what you're going to be practicing the most in class. Okay? Okay. So to be able to understand a poem and to do well on poetry responses, you first have to be able to identify what is an idea. Okay? And you might be watching this going, Madame, that's obvious, we know, whatever. That's great. If this is obvious and this is repetitive for you, I love that. But every single year, I get to halfway through the semester, we've done poetry, we've done images, we're 2 different types of responses, we've moved on, and people still don't know what an idea is. And you're going to be asked to find ideas for several responses. Okay, so you need to know how to identify what an idea is and to not make mistakes in how you word them. Okay? So what is an idea? Well, an idea is a message that is communicated in the poem or any text, image, article, whatever. It is not a theme, nor is it a summary of the text. So I don't want to see something that says, the poem is about a guy who misses his dad and talks to his sister about it. That's a summary, okay? I don't want to see something that says, the poem is about regret. That's a theme, okay? So themes and summaries you want to avoid. What an idea is that big message that covers the entire poem, what you are meant to take away, okay? In other words, it's what you felt the author or the narrator who's speaking wants to tell you or to teach you, what you are meant to take away from the text. So again, as a little bit of a cheat, I always say, when you think idea, think message, think lesson. Those are kind of some key words to make sure you're not making the mistake. So it's always going to be a statement. It's not going to be one word because that would be a theme. And it's not going to be a paragraph because that's probably closer to a summary. It's one statement. It is about this thing. This is what they're telling me. This is what I've been taught as a lesson. Okay? Okay, some examples of how you can make that difference between the 3. So let's use the novel The Help by Kathryn Stockett because, granted, given you're in grade 12, and if you've been in my class, we've probably all read it in grade 11. So this should be easy to connect to. So The Help by Kathryn Stockett. A theme, there are several, could be racism. Racism is present in the entire novel, right? Through the whole 500 pages or however long it was, definitely racism is prevalent, right? It's experienced by many. It is carried out by some, lived as a consequence by others. Racism is prevalent throughout the entire novel. Same thing as courage, right? People being able to stand up to others, doing things that are difficult because it's for the greater good, for the benefit of their own lives, whatever. Courage is absolutely present in the entire novel. Minnie leaving her husband, right? Celia standing up to the women of town. Skeeter allowing herself to be ostracized. The women putting themselves at risk of being found doing this book. All different examples of courage, okay? So those are themes. Notice how it's one word, how it's present in the entire text, but you wouldn't go to a friend and say, the book's about racism. That's too simplified. That's not its main idea. That is not its main message. It's just a topic throughout the entire text. A summary, or in other words, a synopsis, would be how you would summarize it to someone if you were trying to sell them the idea of the book. Again, for a poem, it would be much shorter, naturally. But if you were trying to explain to someone without overly spoiling everything, that's what a summary or a synopsis would look like. So I just made one up here. A young woman returns to her very conservative southern town and with the help of 2 black maids chooses to challenge the racist norms by anonymously writing a book about how black people are treated in the South during the Jim Crow era. That kind of covers what happens in the book. Naturally, there's other things. There's her relationship with her mom, her relationship with Stuart. There's the whole, trying to get away from this conservative area and live more of a liberated life. Like, there's so much more that's happening in the book, but the essence of the book is about Skeeter, Minnie, Aibileen coming together and writing this novel together, right? So this covers it. And if you were telling someone about the book, then they know it has to do with race. It has to do with Jim Crow era. So we're talking about segregation. We're talking about one woman who's assigned to challenge the norms. So that kind of covers the main ideas of what to expect if you were to pick up this book for the first time and read it. There wouldn't be too many crazy surprises that the book's going on another direction. But that is not a main idea, okay? That's covering the whole thing, okay? Now, an idea is about what you learned, okay? So if when we finish the book and we sit in class and we discuss what it was about, that's the idea. What were you guys supposed to learn, right? Like, what was Catherine Stockett saying? What was Skeeter learning, right? And what resonates with you when you get to the end of the reading? So I just made up one example here, and there could be many. It takes incredible courage and sacrifice to make a difference in the world. That's one simplified idea that could be communicated in this novel. It takes incredible courage and sacrifice to make a difference. I would think that's something that's communicated in this novel, right? These women put themselves at great risk. They have to make sacrifices in their life, like make lots of changes, they lose things, but they're making a difference. They're changing the way people are thinking in their environment, making people be more considerate, as we saw at the end of the novel. There are other ideas in this novel, okay? It doesn't have to be just that. Another idea can be friendship is a very strong force, whatever, right? Because by working together, Minnie and Aibileen and Skeeter, they kind of get through these difficulties, okay? Another idea could be just because something is done one way doesn't mean that it's the right way. I'd say that's a message in the text because a lot of it is about not just racism, but about Skeeter deciding, I don't want to be a stay-at-home housewife. I don't want to get married. I want a career. I don't want to have to be the pretty beauty standard of everybody else. So just because it's one way doesn't mean it has to be that way and that it's the right way. That's another idea communicated in the novel. So again, it's a lesson you take away. It's what the author wanted you to really come away from with as an idea, okay? So again, not a theme, not one word, not a paragraph that covers the whole thing beginning to end, but you want to have a statement of a lesson or a message, okay? Okay, so some tips. Don't make these mistakes. First and foremost, don't start the response saying the poem communicates a main idea. I absolutely cannot stand when someone starts the poem or the response on their poem this way. A main idea is very vague. Obviously, it communicates a main idea. The prompt asks you to find a main idea. So if your first sentence of your prompt or your response is the poem communicates a main idea, my immediate answer or response to that is going to be, okay, what main idea? Tell me. So it's a wasted sentence. You just wasted a whole line of your response and of your time writing what is empty. It means nothing. So instead of saying a main idea, tell me what it is, rather than another sentence clarifying it. So don't just make generalized statements. Instead say the poem communicates courage is hard come by, whatever. Okay, that's what it's about. Friendship is a strong force. That's what the poem is saying. Whatever the poem's going to be about, you decide naturally, but say it in that first sentence. Don't give me a generalized, the poem communicates a main idea. Tell me what the main idea is from the beginning. Don't leave your main idea to be shared at the end of the response. I can see where in some types of writing it's really creative to kind of leave your reader guessing and then the answers at the end. In some types of writing, that can be effective and engaging. You don't want to do it in a response. This is an exam, okay? We are evaluating your ability to find a message, to justify yourself, to be organized, to develop your points. That's all about argumentation and organization. So don't try and be like crazy creative by leaving it at the end. Tell us right at the beginning, okay? So first sentence, okay, maybe second if you had an introductory sentence, but right at the beginning it should be clear. I think the poem is about this, okay? Because again, typically that's the prompt you're going to be asked. If you're asked which poem you preferred, make it obvious at the beginning. The poem I preferred is whatever the title, okay? Don't leave it up to question because when we are reading it, we are looking for it to be clear and developed, right? You guys have looked at those rubrics before. Clear and developed is your goal. If you are absolutely, making an amazing argument, it can be above level, right? It can be fives. But you don't want to be leaving us going, okay, what are they talking about? Or, I'm not sure what they mean. If I have to question it while I'm reading your response and I only get it at the end, you were only somewhat clear, right? Kind of clear. You can't get fours, you can't get fives because it wasn't obvious as I was reading it. So state it right at the beginning, okay? Don't just talk about the poem in a general sense without specific points. This is a mistake that people make often when they're just not confident about the poem, right? They don't know what they want to say. They weren't really sure how to answer the prompt. So they just kind of blah, blah. Okay, so don't just talk about the poem and say, the poem is this, and the author says that, and this line does this. If it's asking you for a main idea, and it's asking you for techniques, tell me what the main idea is, tell me which technique, find me quotes, justify it. Like, have a structure. So don't just like blah, blah about the poem, or don't just say, if the prompt isn't about your particular preference or how you reacted to it, don't just say, I like the poem by this author. The poem says this. If it's about a main idea and techniques, have the main idea, have the techniques, have specific points. Don't just blah, blah. Okay, because blah, blah is not answering the prompt. You're going to get below level, failing marks. Okay. These ones are pretty obvious. So when we're following the steps, we're going to see a template shortly. When you're following the steps of how to make an argument, don't forget to first name the technique. Just don't assume that we know what you mean. So if you pulled out a metaphor of a poem, I know it's a metaphor. The other teachers marking it know it's a metaphor. I want to know that you know it's a metaphor. So make sure that you say the metaphor in this line, okay? Name the technique. Don't assume that we're going to figure it out for you, okay? Don't forget to quote it, and I've been saying that since you guys were in grade 9. Anytime you have a point, make sure you quote the line or the paragraph, depending on the context here. Make sure you quote exactly, this is the one I'm talking about. Because what we often find students do is they say, there is a metaphor, and they kind of just chat about it. But without telling us exactly where it is, I don't know that you understand what a metaphor is. I want to see that you can point out line 3, that's a metaphor. So make sure you quote it. Don't forget to explain how or why the technique is used, because again, that's the prompt you're going to be asked most commonly. So what I find a lot of students do the first time we write our poetry response, for you guys it's going to be Mother to Son or Where There's a Wall. What I often find people do as a mistake here is they say, here's a metaphor, here's the quote, and then they move on. Here's a simile, here's the quote. And it communicates the message. But just saying, and it communicates the message, doesn't tell me how it communicates the message. Can you really break down what that metaphor is saying? Right? Do you know why the author used that metaphor? Like, what's its effect on you as a reader? Breaking down that process. So the how or the why, arguably the most important thing that you're doing in your response, takes up the most space in your writing, like in your text. And it's the most important thing that people skip. So don't forget to actually explain how and why, not just here it is, here's the quote, okay? And don't forget to use transitions to keep it organized, okay? I said this all the time. Again, we are looking for it to be clear, organized, fluid. So when I can see obviously that you're moving on, you use the word furthermore, however, additionally. When I know that you've put that word there, it's an automatic cue to me, okay, they're done with that point, we're doing another point. We're either adding or contrasting, whatever. So use those transitions. It helps us know that it's not all one big blob that blends together. Because if your writing isn't very strong and you don't use transitions, sometimes it feels like 3 points kind of became 1 point. It wasn't obvious how point 1 and point 2 were 2 separate things. They kind of sound the same. Transitions help keep that divided and organized. So don't forget to use transitions. Okay, so a possible template. There's no saying that everyone's going to write it the same way. This is just one way of making sure that you cover all your bases. So if you are asked, what is the poem about and which techniques communicated it, this is kind of how you could support your response, how you could structure it. The first step is answer the prompt. Get straight to it, as I said before. So the main idea of the poem is blah, 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 whatever your statement is. Okay, courage is an admirable thing. Friendship is a strong force, whatever the poem's about. Okay, that should be right at the beginning. That's the first thing I want you guys to do. Okay, step 2, this is the brunt of your response. This is going to be 85% of what you write is in step 2. And as you can see, I put you're going to be repeating this 3 to 4 times, maybe more if you've got lots of time and if you're really concise in your writing. But this is what you're going to be doing a lot of. So for every point you make, you've got to state what your point is, okay? You've got to support it, and you've got to explain it. State, support, explain. 3 steps for every point. Does that mean it has to be 3 sentences for every point? Not at all. But there are 3 steps you're going to follow, 3 things that have to be included to make the point feel well-rounded and clear. So in this type of prompt, the one that I said is most common, what's the main idea and which techniques? When I say state the point, you're going to say, there is a metaphor. Look at that. That's 3 words. That's 1 step done. Okay? Support the point. There is a metaphor in the line. Quote, 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 quote. And quote it, please. Make it clear. Okay, that could have been 1 sentence there. But you've done 2 things already. Now, this is where you're going to have the meat. This is where you're going to write the most. You're going to explain how it makes your point or communicates this idea you stated at the beginning. If you said the poem was about friendship is a strong force, okay, well, how did this metaphor in that line communicate that message? Here's where you're going to explain it. And I always like to write on the board, you might have seen it before, it should almost create like a mental arrow back up to here, that when I get to the end of the point, I can see this message in that explanation. So it should be like obvious where the link is back to that main idea. Okay? When you're done these 3 things, what do? You add a transition and do it all again with a new point. So about 3 to 4 times, you're following these steps. And then you always want to end your response by bringing the whole poem into focus. Naturally, if you're pressed for time, if you didn't have enough points or whatever, sometimes we don't have time for a conclusion. In a perfect world, you want to end the poem with a sentence or 2 where you just kind of talk about the whole thing. All these points got me here, right? Or maybe it's related to the theme. Maybe it's a personal connection you're going to add, whatever. But you always want to give it a little oomph at the end, so kind of a mini conclusion when you can. Okay? Is it always possible? No. And I recognize that. But really, this is the goal of the response. This is that cherry on top. So you might say, I really liked this message, and I really liked the way they communicated it, and it resonated with me, right? At the end, you get to reflect on it personally, add a connection. Maybe you're just, commenting on the author, whatever. But you always want to end the whole response by bringing the poem into focus. Kind of a nice little conclusion. Okay? That is a possible template. Okay, so for practice. So naturally, you want to go watch my video with an example on an analysis of 1 exam. So I said I was going to do trombone solo and I Think Continually. This is just going to be a sample of how you would annotate, how you would write on the page, how you would structure your response. There's many ways you're going to do it. Every poem is going to be different, but you can go watch that. That's an example. In class, you're going to write 2 poetry responses. Our first one is Mother to Son or Where There's a Wall. I love this one. So that is going to be your first, call it practice. I mean, everything counts anyways, but still. And then you were going to write the weather. Okay, and the weather is another really good one. That'll be another practice that you're writing. Does that mean that's the only ones you can do? No. I want you to write responses for the other poems we practice in class. Okay, it's not mandatory. I'm not going to give you guys homework and say, everybody bring this one in for tomorrow. But when we do a practice in class, you're going to have the copy. If you're not confident that you are very good at annotating a poem, at making a plan, at justifying your points, whatever the thing is, then take that one, take it home, and give it a try. You can bring it back to me. I will give it another read. I can give you extra comments on what you're improving, where you're maybe missing the mark again. But write the other ones. Okay, we're not just going to read just these 2. We're going to do several in class. So practice those other ones if you want to improve your ability to analyze and to write about poetry. Okay? Find extra examples on my website and give them a try on your own. This link will be provided in class. And make sure that before you do any of this, you're comfortable identifying techniques. You will not be able to succeed at poetry analysis if you don't know how to understand the poem. And poetry is, the vast majority of the time, figurative. It's not just obvious given to you in your face. You've got to read between the lines. If you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know what a metaphor is, or personification, or euphemism, whatever, you're going to struggle. So this is really the first thing you need to make sure you understand. Then you can do these practices, okay? And that's about it, okay? If you guys have any questions, if you want to show me practices that you've done, you can bring it to me. Again, I typically like to do lunch sessions, so we can sit over lunch, we can go over poems together. I'm more than welcome. You just have to request that. But again, start with the video of trombone solo, I think, continually, and then we'll see how we do in class with those two practices and go from there. So that is poetry responses.